Welcome to Novelty Show, the podcast where we spill the truth about the ups and downs of writing and the ins and outs of the publishing industry. I'm Alexa.
I'm Kat.
I'm Lainey, and this is episode 4, Writing to the Market.
We'd like to start this episode by thanking our patrons for voting on this topic, and stay tuned until the end of the show where we'll answer our Patreon question of the week.
All right, guys, I love this topic.
I'm excited.
I'm kind of nervous.
So, writing to the market. What does that even mean, Alexa?
I feel called out. So the market is the market. The market is what sells. And we can't forget, as much as we love writing, as much as writing is creative, it's artistic, that it's also a business. If you want people to read your words and pay you money for them, it's a business. And so thus you must pay attention to the market. And the question of writing to the market is, do you tailor your writing and your writing projects and choices to what sells?
Mm-hmm.
I think we should also say that we're coming from a YA lens, and I feel like that market is very high stakes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And very finicky.
Yes, and especially from a YA lens as of spring 2019, the industry is in a very interesting place right now. Let's just say that.
Yeah, and I think that's why the topic comes up. It's asked a lot. You know, our patrons wanted this topic. I was on a panel yesterday at the LA Times Festival of Books, and this question came up. I think it's in the front of many writers' minds because YA is so saturated. It feels like there's a lot of competition, and honestly there is.
It also feels like a rat race, pretty much.
Also, generally, we're seeing diminishing returns on the literal sales side. So authors are seeing fewer copies being sold. It's not uncommon that a successful book that hits the New York Times list only sells 5,000 copies, and you go, only? But several years ago, when YA was booming in a much different way and it was less saturated, you could have a first week of sales, if you're a pretty successful title, of 10,000 copies. Overall, it's diminishing returns. People are selling less, which means publishers are buying less, which means they're paying you less, and it's also harder to get your foot in the door. So in many ways, the market matters.
Yeah, we had that big YA boom, and now we're all coming down from it.
And it's also fair to say that we aren't just going to talk about the traditional market, because trends in the traditional publishing market also impact the self-publishing indie market, and that market matters as well. There's considerations to take in terms of what types of titles sell in different areas of publishing in different mediums, and we're going to dig into all of the things that go into the market.
Alexa, you might know the numbers for this, about how many debut authors there were in a given year. I feel like last year it was a lot more.
If you're going based just on the debut groups, which is our best metric, they're anywhere from 150 to 220 YA and middle grade debuts in any given year, across all traditional publishers. So that includes small publishers, small all the way up to big. That is a lot of new people fighting for sales, fighting for subsequent book contracts, and think about kind of the numbers they whittled down from to get agented to sell a book.
Yeah, and those are just the new people in the market, not to mention all of the authors who debuted over the last couple of years who are trying to continue publishing.
Oh no. It's Hunger Games.
It is.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it feels like the Hunger Games.
No, it's more like I feel like it's more like a gladiator ring, in fact. It's like the new kid on the block fighting the seasoned gladiator who's killed many before you. Yeah.
Is that a threat?
More like it's time for me to discover my magical power in the arena
Right.
as in a YA novel.
This is all really comforting for Kat and I.
Yeah, great.
Well, and I think that's why the question comes up and why it's interesting to answer. And it's interesting to answer from the point of view of getting into the industry more recently, because you're going to hear very different answers from more seasoned authors who don't have to think as much about the market because they have pretty firm footing in their career. I think this is a question newer writers, we have to have this conversation. And my good news personally at least it's how I feel. I think you can arm yourself with knowledge and you can make smart choices. And yes, you can Ravenclaw your way or Slitherclaw your way into the industry.
Yeah. So can you write to the market, and should you write to the market?
Yes and yes and no and no. It's very complicated.
I feel like you need to be aware of the market. You don't need to base every single decision off of it. You don't need to cater everything you write to the market, but just having that awareness of what is currently selling, what is currently not selling, it can help inform your decisions on what to write, but not be the only deciding factor.
Yeah, I feel like since I'm so entrenched with the YA community, I'm very aware of what the market is, what it's selling, and I think about it, but I don't really follow it. I mean, maybe I do because I write YA fantasy, which is pretty typical.
Yeah, it's kind of an evergreen genre.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing. Some things never die.
But also I feel like there's a little nuances in YA fantasy, things that just aren't working anymore. People really can't write YA fantasies about assassins. That's just kind of...
Chosen One.
Yeah.
Elemental magic is also tricky. It's not that you can't have it, but if you're too... There have just been many big titles already published that kind of slotted into that space. So it's important to be aware of essentially micro trends. And the number one thing is you should be reading.
Yeah.
You should be reading books in the genre. It's
Current
a pretty good
books,
indicator.
books that came out this year.
But that brings us to the big thing that you have to discuss when you talk about the market. And I think this is the number one thing where you have authors who will say, no, you can't write to the market. And I don't disagree with them. And that is the essential fact of how slow publishing is and how what you see on bookshelves, those purchasing decisions were made 2 to 3 years ago. And those writers wrote those books or started writing those books 3, 4, 5 years ago. So once you see it on a bookshelf, you are behind.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict what's going to be the next big thing until it's already here. And so as a writer who's not agented, is just trying to get her book published or book represented, it's just really hard to balance what is coming up and if I'm behind, if I'm writing something that's just something that's going to be dead in 2 years. It's frustrating too as a writer because it's like you constantly feel like you're running out of time and you need to get that agent, you need to sell the book, and you need to compete with everybody else in the Hunger Games that is trying to also get that one spot, and it's stressful.
I follow a lot of book deal announcements, and every time I see one that mentions a trope that I am currently writing, I just get this like overwhelming sense of anxiety, like, oh, I'm too late, I'm falling behind. The publishers are buying this trope right now. They're not going to want it anymore in 6 months or a year from now.
No, same. I did before I sold, and I still do now. You go into the deals with this sense of apprehension. It's always that terror that someone got there first. Because I think what is just the unfair, unfortunate truth is that publishing is very much about luck and timing. And it is very true that sometimes someone can beat you to an idea, a trope, a combination of tropes. And sometimes it's true that there can only be one. Or one book can kill a trend. One book can create a trend, and you never know. So sometimes seeing a book deal that is spiritually similar to what you're working on is great because it means, ooh, another publisher. So let's say something sells to Penguin Random House. HarperCollins might want to load up on a similar book, and maybe you can be that book. Sometimes, however, HarperCollins and Macmillan and Hachette will go, oh, Penguin Random House bought that kind of unique thing. Nah. And you never know. And publishing is always feeling slightly sick to your stomach. that months and years of your work is in vain. And oh God. And sometimes it does happen. You will see a deal, especially when it's by someone super famous, way more famous than you. And they're able to publish the thing and you cannot publish the thing. It hurt. I'm still sad about a book I had to shelve, but famous people get to write similar books. It hurts.
I mean, it is like a double-edged sword because every time I see a publishing deal announcement that has the trope that I'm writing or the dynamic that I'm writing, I'm like, oh, good, that's selling, but also, oh no, that's selling, and I'm not ready to sell mine.
And it's just really important to know, we're mentioning that we're following book deal announcements, which is very good. You should be following book deal announcements if you really want to keep up with the market. There are many places to do that. There's Publishers Weekly, which posts them twice a week, and it's free, but it's a small selection of book deals. You can also follow Publishers Marketplace, which is a paid tool, or it's just you can follow people on Twitter and pay attention to when they announce books. And what's important to know is that from the time you see that announcement, that book isn't going to be on shelves for 12 months to 18 months to 2 years. Kind of books go on very extended cycles from the time that they're bought to the time that they are actually published. So if you're following deal announcements, you're like 18 months to 2 years ahead of the curve of following based on bookstores, but you're still probably at least a year behind on when those trends started picking up with agents acquiring clients and going on sub with things.
Right. Like the books that are selling right now in spring 2019 are almost all of them are slated for 2021.
Yes. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a crapshoot of whether one thing selling means they're going to buy a ton more, or whether it's like there can only be one and they'll wait to see how it does in the market. But generally speaking, there's let's say a trend does spark and all the publishers decide we're going to buy this thing. Your window to sell is anywhere from 6 months to 18 months before the purchasing window closes. Sometimes they close very fast, and sometimes they are a little bit longer. For the average trend, something like Dystopia, I think that buying window was open for a couple of years, but if you miss the window, it closed real hard. I think the larger the trend window, the harder the door closes behind your ass.
And the funny thing is about dystopian is that we still see these books on our shelves. They're just not called dystopian anymore. They're pitched as something different.
Yeah, I feel like that's what's going on right now with paranormal. It's just being rebranded as contemporary fantasy.
Yeah.
And that's the fascinating thing about market trends. When you're here long enough, you see the trickery. But in fairness, though, paranormal was dead before contemporary fantasy was allowed to be reborn like a phoenix.
Right.
It really was dead until it wasn't. Same thing with Dystopia. I think we've seen it rebranded, but I think we're going to see it creep back in other ways as well.
Yeah, but there was a period where it was dead, and like readers had dystopian fatigue. Like I went through that myself. I did not want to touch a dystopian book.
I think I started my YouTube channel right when it started on the decline. So I was just reading a whole bunch of dystopian, and then I don't even know what year it was where I just I can't do it anymore.
Right.
They stopped buying them in 2012, 2013. So the last of the death cough of dystopian, a couple of them were released in 2014 or 2015. But it's been pretty solidly dead the entire time I have been writing and trying to get published.
And that's interesting that it was dying at that point, because the Hunger Game movies, which is kind of what inspired this whole trend, was still premiering.
I mean, the Twilight movies were coming out long past the time paranormal and vampires were dead in traditional publishing. And that's what's really tricky. If you're only looking to the ends of the cycles in pop culture and public consumption, you're gonna think something is still selling that is not.
Like the Maze Runner movie is much more recent, when that genre has been dead in the publishing industry for a while.
That kind of leads into the fact that pop culture and what we see in movies and TV don't always translate into what we read.
Yeah, I've seen the misconception, and I dispel it constantly, and people argue with me that they see Marvel movies and they see how popular superheroes are in movies and television, and they're convinced, well, I can write a superhero book. And they don't believe me when I tell them people have been trying to make fetch happen in YA publishing with superheroes for forever. There haven't been any breakout YA superhero books, and then people are going to throw out titles, but I have a rebuttal for you. Because they don't really work in novels, and publishing they don't like them. It is almost impossible to get an agent with a superhero YA, let alone sell it. There's a pocket of potential in middle grade, and there's a pocket of potential in adult, but they have never landed in young adult fiction. The only people allowed to write superhero books are super famous, best-selling authors.
Mm-hmm. Which is why we have Marissa Meyer with her Renegade series, V.E. Schwab with the Villain series.
Though that's adult. And so she
True.
she found the pocket. I'm like,
right.
You're smart.
There are ways around it. You know, you can have your characters with superpowers in a contemporary fantasy book. Like, it's like a paranormal with superpowers, but you frame it a little bit differently.
Pivot and write about magic instead. There are workarounds. So really, the lesson is that you should write something, become a super mega famous best-selling author, and then you can write anything you want.
Cool.
No, really, that is the lesson. That is the goal.
That is, yeah.
That's how Holly Black got to write vampires when vampires were dead. And it's a great book. But it's definitely an outlier. And I think that when you're following market trends, you can't just look to the most famous examples or most famous authors to say, oh, well, famous author wrote this book. That means I can write this book. The rules are different for debut and unknown authors than they are for super mega famous successful people. And the rules are different for the film industry and television, essentially visual mediums, than for novel-length fiction.
Right. With the well-established best-selling authors, it's not the premise that is selling, it's their name. They're what is selling. Not whatever plot they have that is on trend or off trend, it's because of their name. Whereas if you're a debut author or just an author who is mid-list, not very established, it is much more about the plot and the story than your name, because you don't have much of an established name at that point.
Yeah, and trust me, I really wanted Scott Westerfeld and Marissa Meyer to create a superhero YA trend, and it did not happen. Which really brings up the question, have we ever tried to write to the market, successfully or unsuccessfully? How much do we personally consider the market when it comes to choosing our book projects?
The first book I wrote, this shows how naive I was with the market, because I wrote a retelling when retellings were kind of dead. And I didn't realize that until after I decided to shelve that book.
What did you retell? Because I would posit that it's about what you're retelling.
It was not anything special. Like Jane Eyre in Space, that is a cool retelling. Mine was mine was just Little Red Riding Hood. It's like so unoriginal.
That's actually not terrible. I'm going to give you some credit, because here's the thing.
Oh, thanks.
In retellings, from a market perspective, because I can only think of one Little Red Riding, or I guess I can think of a few. It depends on when you wrote it. Did you write it during the paranormal craze?
I wrote it in 2014.
Well, that's not bad. I'm giving you lots of credit. No, because in retelling specifically, the overdone ones are Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Beauty and the Beast, Pride and Prejudice, to like call out myself. I purposely chose a different Jane Austen book because Pride and Prejudice has been done so often. I'd say those are the like super famous big ones. Oh, and The Wizard of Oz. A lot of people try to tackle that one.
And especially once there is a big retelling that sells, like Wizard of Oz, there was Danielle Page's series.
Yes.
That was very big, and that kind of killed Wizard of Oz retellings for everyone else for a while.
And that's the tricky thing with these market trends, is that one book or one series can either open the door for a ton more, or there can only be one. Mm-hmm. So once one specific retelling breaks out, you're kind of screwed. Mm-hmm. But this brings me to, I did write to the market. I've been very aware of the market, mostly because I've had the heartache. I wrote 2 books in a row that were very off market, and I had heartache. I wrote time travel and I wrote superheroes. Can you feel all my feelings coming through? But they were hard lessons to learn. I spent years on the superhero book in particular, and you learn about the market the hard way, like you did, Lainey. I think that that's very common, and I adore sci-fi, and sci-fi, there's nothing worse than being a YA sci-fi writer in terms of heartache and heartbreak, because some of the biggest tropes in sci-fi just don't land in novels. They're all over movies and TV, and you just can't write them. And sci-fi goes in wave trends, and the trends are very short. your windows to get sci-fi published are atrociously short. And then once they die, once the door closes on sci-fi, it closes for years. And that's not the case with fantasy or contemporary, which are evergreen. There will always be a readership for them, even if there are micro trends within them. So I religiously paid attention to the market. And I had Jane Eyre in Space as an idea in my drawer for 2 years. And I waited. And I saw micro trends starting. And I took a gamble. And I wrote my book in 3 months flat. I queried as soon as possible because I was like, this sales window, I'll be lucky if it's 18 months. Hopefully it is. If it's 12, I might not make it. And I made it. And I know it sounds really calculating of me, but yeah, I wrote to the market. Yeah, I have zero regrets because I got to write the book I desperately wanted to write. But if I'd written it 2 years earlier or 2 years later, I would have had heartache.
Yeah, and it's not about being like super calculating and only writing to the market. It's more about just knowing your timing. You know, it's a book that you wanted to write. It just wasn't the right time for a while until it was.
Like in 2013, that market was just dead. So I didn't write it till 2015.
So I have unsuccessfully written to the market, kind of. My first book that I wrote was an angel book back in 2009.
No.
Yeah.
Oh no.
I was just at the tail end of it. Like when I was querying, I still saw angel books selling. So like I could have gotten in, but all of my query rejections were like, you know, you're a good writer. I'd love to see something else from you, but this just won't stand out in the market. And that hurt. But it's true. It was right at the tail end of that. Like the window was closing and I just got closed out of it.
That's what I got on my time travel. Like, send us something else.
Yeah.
This doesn't work for the market. Exactly. Okay, so we've covered the kind of ruthlessly pragmatic aspect of this topic. But let's talk a bit more about the art and the love, because I think the key is to be aware but not to let the market drive all of your decisions, because I feel that it shows in your writing, and I think readers can feel it if you only write something because you think it will sell.
Right. And it's important to keep in mind that there are other things that can impact your book selling.
As many doom and gloom examples as we can trot out, and I always do that to warn people, there's some amazing outliers, like debut author outliers, who didn't necessarily write to trend, but they brought something back, or they were the person to refresh the genre. Like we mentioned, contemporary fantasy is a thing now, and it's a way for you to get some of your favorite paranormal tropes back into YA. And it took several writers cleverly doing that to open that door again. And I'm glad no one told them not to write their books.
Right.
And also something that I think is worth bringing up, kind of this is a side topic to the market question. And this comes up a lot in the conversation of diversity in publishing and diverse books. And I think it's just very important to acknowledge. And that is, I think it's important not to be too discouraging and too hardline about doors being closed when it comes to writers from vastly different backgrounds from the writers who have been dominating the publishing industry for a very long time, meaning who can bring unique perspectives, whether that's a cultural background, a specific racial identity, or it could be a queer identity or angle to something. I hesitate to call it an angle, but meaning there are fresh ways to tell quote unquote old stories. And I would never want to tell a writer not to write something because they could be the one who just really like changes the game. They could be the one who does something with superheroes, for example, that blows everyone's minds. And I will be the first person cheering them on because I'm like, please bring it in, make it work. So I think it's always very important to not stop yourself from writing the thing that you're burning to write.
Right.
Because it could be the one.
Yeah. Like we want you all to have like a healthy dose of pragmatism, and just like be realistic about what might or might not sell. but don't take that as discouragement. Like, keep that optimism that your idea, even if it's not to market, even if everyone is telling you that that trend is dead, like, you could still bring it back. You could still have an outlier. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to rely on that and to, believe completely that you're going to have an outlier, but it is a possibility. And like Alexa said, don't get discouraged. Don't count yourself out because you can always bring something fresh and interesting that hasn't been done before.
Yeah, it's definitely the awareness, because right now I'm writing a pirate book. Those don't sell.
But it has witches, Lainey. Witches are back.
Yeah, but that's something I knew going into it. I'm like, historically, pirates don't sell very well in YA fantasy, or in the YA market, but I'm going to do it anyway because I try to combat that a lot in my writing, trying to spin it in a different way or not lean into certain tropes and not heavily say that it's a pirate book, even though it is.
And that's another thing. If you're aware of what specifically about your subgenre has made the market saturated, you can turn those tropes and elements around. You can approach them with a fresh view because you know what's been done before. It really is just about awareness of the market.
Absolutely. And the fact is that markets cycle, trends cycle. Everything does come back. The thing is, it'll never come back exactly the same way it was before. Like zombies. Right? Okay, yes. But meaning vampire YA is coming back. But it's not going to look like Twilight. There have been one or two announcements. Some editors and agents have said they want to see vampires again, but they're stressing that it has to be fresh. You can't write 2007 era paranormal YA and expect it to sell in today's market. What's 2019's paranormal YA? What is the 2019 or really 2021 vampire book? And apply that for whatever it is. We're seeing witches come back, but they're completely different from 2008 YA witches. Pirate books. What is the 2021-2022 pirate YA fantasy? It's all about timing. It's all about spinning tropes and subverting tropes and following every aspect of the market trends, because a huge thing is that the style of YA, which we covered in one of our previous episodes, kind of what defines YA and what is YA. And YA has gotten a lot darker over the years. And that's one of the many reasons why a 2008 style YA paranormal can't sell in the current market. So what's next? And the other thing I think is worth kind of holding in your heart is, because no trend is dead forever, no market is dead forever, unless it is dead forever, as already mentioned, in the medium. But you can always go back to something that you wrote before that wasn't right for the timing, or you can just hold the idea in your head until the timing is right. And if you're in the writing community, if you're paying attention to sales, I also recommend paying attention to pitch contests. It's an excellent way to see what agents are actually interested in, what tweets are they faving, which ones are getting the most requests in a contest, but then who do they actually sign, who actually gets offers, pay attention, and then what actually sells and how fast does it sell can also give you hints.
Also things like hashtag manuscript wishlist, MSWL. You can see what agents are actively looking for, what editors are actively looking for, tropes or dynamics or just like one sentence pitches of something that they're interested in and that they would want to represent or buy. And you can kind of gauge a little bit about what people are looking for from that.
But it's so hard if you see that and you're like, oh, gotta real quick write something really fast.
Right.
That is what makes this so tough, I think, because most writers, most of us, don't write that fast.
Right.
There are some unicorn writers, especially the seasoned professionals, who are actually able to pivot to the market very fast because they can bang out a book in a few months. I am envious of them. But I think it's not worth stressing out about that. That is often a later career strength that people can have. And publishers do the same thing, by the way. They might say to an author who's already multi-published with them, hey, we're seeing this trend turn. Can you crank out a witch book in 2 months? And they do. And mind blown.
It's also an advantage that authors who are established with agents and editors kind of have, in that they can write a pitch and sell on proposal with an outline and 3 chapters, which is something that most debut authors do not have the luxury of doing.
Yes, and so you definitely kind of have to think about it as like aspiring writer debut market awareness and writing and choices, and then once you are published, it is a different ball game. Mm-hmm. You both have to pay greater attention to the market because you're now struggling to sell subsequent books, but also you're at an advantage because you are already agented and you have a foot in the door of the industry, and it is possible for you to get there first, so to speak, and potentially sell on proposal. And so, as an aspiring writer, don't push yourself. Like, if it takes you 1.5 years to write a book, it takes you 1.5 years to write a book. And if you are that writer, you shouldn't pay too much attention to the market because you will simply drive yourself insane.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about things that impact the market. We mentioned earlier that there are, some big hits can create trends or kill trends. What other things sort of create or kill trends or just impact the market in general?
Well, there's definitely a distinction in the markets between traditional publishing and self-publishing that I think are really interesting to talk about and be aware of. There are things that sell in traditional publishing for many reasons, which we can talk about, like literally the format of the books, where the books are sold, the distribution channels for those books, that don't necessarily do as well in self-publishing, but more specifically, it's the things that don't work in traditional publishing that very often are the things that do astronomically well in self-publishing, largely because of medium, ebook, and kind of the rise of Kindle readers and just the ease of getting titles on Amazon.com and similar platforms, and price points, the price points that you see in self-publishing for certain genres. They boom in self-publishing in a way that they don't in traditional publishing. And it really does become a matter of you're writing to the market, but you need to write with your publishing avenue in mind as well.
It's kind of like how paranormal as a genre kind of died in traditional and had to be rebranded as like contemporary fantasy. But in indie publishing and self-publishing, paranormal has been kind of thriving this whole time.
Same thing with urban fantasy, which is kind of it converges with paranormal a lot of the time, because contemporary fantasy can also be the new rebranding of urban fantasy, which is a genre I adore. Same thing, has been thriving in self-publishing this entire time. But then I think the divergence that we see between traditional publishing and self-publishing is, even if these things are coming back to traditional publishing, they don't look the same as the books thriving in self-publishing. They are distinct publishing avenues with different audiences who have different book buying and reading preferences. And kind of under that, it's important to remember that, talking about format, older readers, so adult readers, meaning they are adult humans, tend to prefer, or not prefer, but are very open to ebooks in a way that younger readers, specifically young adult readers, surveys have shown over and over again, they prefer physical books, which gives those younger categories a distinct advantage with younger readers. This is why YA thrives in traditional publishing in a way that it doesn't thrive in the same way in self-publishing, or I should say, if you self-publish YA, you're reaching a different audience.
Specifically with middle grade ebook sales are very, very low. Middle grade physical books is what sells. And with new adult physical books rarely sell, but ebook and indie publishing, they do very well.
Boom.
And YA is kind of that middle ground where some YA readers do read ebooks, but physical books still do very, very well because a lot of the readers either don't have access to e-readers or they just prefer the physical books.
And just one footnote on audiobooks that I found really fascinating when I discovered this. I was talking to a friend who works with Audible and discovered that sci-fi across the board, including YA sci-fi, performs very well in audiobooks, which warmed my cold heart knowing that it performs far more poorly in traditional, like, physical books in YA. So it really is the medium can make a huge difference in terms of which genres work in the market.
That's interesting.
I thought so too. I've gotten a lot of older gentlemen reading my book because they purchased the audiobook.
So I guess one thing is that we all feel it's important to be aware of the market, but is it necessary to write to the market? Is that something that you have to do?
I think if every single writer ruthlessly wrote to the market, everything would fall apart. I think it would we would produce really terrible books.
Yeah.
I think they would lack soul on a certain level. I'm scared of a world where everyone would only write to the market. And also, if everyone wrote to the market, it would ruin the market. Mm-hmm. Saturation is a thing. And generally, that's why the common advice is not to write to the market. The average writer, that is the best advice to give, honestly.
Right.
Because you will always be behind. And you will always be disappointed.
And it might scare you away from trying new things that could end up being brilliant and like new trendsetters. But you're scared off by that because you're like, oh, well, it's not the market. It's not selling right now. And so you're afraid to try.
Yeah, I mean, someone has to write the book that changes the trends.
Yeah.
So you can't always write to the market.
I think the thing about being aware of the market, and that's what we're advising, is that it gives you more realistic expectations for yourself. It's a way of kind of tempering your expectations. So, for example, it's knowing that if you've written a dystopian novel that is very off-trend, off-market right now, that if you're querying, say, 30 agents, that you just need to be aware that you might be auto-rejected by most of those agents just because of what you've written, not because it's bad or terrible, but because of the market. That being aware that if writing what you love, which you should do, that you might face more disappointment, that it might be a harder road to get published. And also sometimes, I will say, write what you love, but if the thing that you love is permanently dead, is never working, that you might need to pivot and change what you love and expand your horizons in terms of either what you're writing or your publishing avenue. Because generally my advice to writers, period, and this is what I said on the panel yesterday, it's being aware of the market and always writing what you love, but trying to love a lot of different things. The ability to pivot and write something different and kind of move your passions in the direction of what is more likely to sell, that's how you successfully navigate the industry. You have to be versatile as a writer. I think that's the important thing that I want to stress. Always write what you love, but try to love a lot of things.
Yeah, and also don't take it necessarily as discouragement if what you are writing is off trend. Take it more of a challenge to, make your idea different and bring something fresh to it. If you love something and you're set on writing vampires and the market is saturated with lots of vampire stories, you can use that as a way to, change your vampire story. Like, what can you add to your vampire story that will make it different and interesting and fresh compared to everything else that's already out there?
Yeah, I would say that, you should always be writing what you would like to see. It just might not be the thing that everybody else wants to see right now. So you can always come back to it and revisit it, make it better, and eventually sell it.
And also, I think it's important to know, and this goes to the con column of aggressively writing to the market, just because you write something that aggressively fits the market doesn't mean it's good. Mm-hmm. And also, there's the timing piece. You can smartly pivot to write to the market, but someone gets there first. Mm-hmm. Nothing is a guarantee.
Yeah, and especially if it's not something that you're truly passionate about and you were writing just to the market and someone gets there first, that's incredibly discouraging, and you feel like, oh, I tried to write to the market and it didn't work, and I don't even actually like this story that much. I was just doing it for this reason.
I'll tell you, sometimes people who write in a calculated manner and aggressively to the market, it does pay off for them. They do get a huge book deal. Some of them are breakouts, and they got published, but you actually love the thing that's on trend maybe. Mm-hmm. and you missed your shot. There's just so much disappointment in publishing, and just prepare for it, I think is what I'm trying to say. That publishing is really complicated. Writing is weird and organic and nebulous and confusing. You can always only just do the best you can in the moment. And the thing is, we mentioned that your project doesn't always have to be dead. And I joked that the key is to become famous and super successful, and then you can write anything you want. But I'm really not kidding. Once you get your foot in the door of publishing, if you do moderately reasonably well on whatever book it is that you get your foot in the door on, or the first couple of books, you really do give yourself the opportunity to take more risks with story and potentially get certain things published. There are lots of fantastic stories. Like Claire Legrand is an excellent story, a beacon of hope for writers. Furyborn was her first big ambitious book that she was working on when she was younger, and it wasn't working and the timing was wrong, and she got other stuff published, but then was able to write this book of her heart and get it published later, and it's a huge hit. That idea in that book needed time, and she needed to establish herself in her career in order to get to write that book.
And sometimes you just get lucky. Like Marissa Meyer, who wrote a sci-fi fairy tale retelling series, which I feel like both of those weren't exactly on trend when she wrote them, but
they weren't at all. No,
yeah, she made them a trend, and now she's writing superheroes, which aren't on trend.
Goals.
Yeah, honestly.
And honestly, like Marie Lu is still writing dystopian, and she can do it because she has such a big fan base that love those books. I'm one of those people. I can't wait for the next one in the series to come out.
She's another actually great hopeful story, actually, because she also has a YA historical coming out. It's about Mozart's sister, I believe. Fun fact, she wrote that book before Legend.
Wow.
And tried to sell it and couldn't sell it. And now she can get that published, this old book of her heart. And I love stories like that. She never let go of that idea that she loved. That book that she loved, she wrote the book. Because S.J. Jones tried to acquire it, and her publisher wouldn't let her buy it. She was an editor at a publisher, and that's how she became friends with Marie Lu. She told this at a book event or something, so this isn't like secret knowledge. I think it might have come up on the Pub Crawl podcast as well. But I love that story.
And you also get authors writing not necessarily dead genres, but tropes that people seem to be tired of, like the chosen one trope, which gets a lot of shit. But like Veronica Roth is writing, it's like an adult Harry Potter chosen one type thing.
I'm kind of excited.
I'm excited
yeah,
too.
I'm like, ooh, this sounds like throwing everything I love but that's been off-trend into a blender, and I'm kind of here for it.
And Cassie Clare and Holly Black wrote a middle grade chosen one wizard school, like Harry Potter-esque story, but because they're both aware of Harry Potter, they were able to twist tropes and subvert expectations for certain things. Same thing with Rainbow Rowell with Carry On. She wrote this wizard magic boarding school book that kind of addresses tropes that Harry Potter used and subverts them in unexpected ways.
Yeah, so I think the important thing, because all these people we're mentioning are essentially outliers. You're going to see books from them that are a bit surprising, and the key is both to be hopeful because they created careers and created avenues where they get to write these passion projects, but not to look at the books that come out and go, oh, that means I can also get published with a book like that. You have to walk the line of like pragmatism and hope.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's a very tricky line to walk.
That's just the rule of publishing, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
And now it is time for our Patreon question of the week. And this one is from Jessica, who asks, when doing comp titles in your query, should you only list specific titles or can you list authors? I think that you can list authors, but you got to be very sure that your writing style and how your book is written is similar to the author that you're comparing yourself to.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that if you're naming an author, they tend to write very similar books. Like if you're going to comp Victoria Schwab, she writes a lot of different books over a lot of different genres. So you want to be more specific than just Victoria Schwab.
Well, and then indeed, that might be a case where you're saying this would appeal to fans of the Shades of Magic series.
Right.
You're being specific, but it's not necessarily you're only naming one of the books in that series. It's the vibe and tone of the whole thing, which is the same thing for an author. You're saying essentially that fans of that author would very likely purchase your book, and you need to be aware of why. What is the promise that you're delivering on? Is it their writing style? Is it the tropes that they use? So you kind of need to know. Generally speaking, it's better to use specific book titles when you can, because it tells them my book would sell like this book. And that's usually what they're looking for.
Yeah, I believe when I've queried and when I plan to query my current projects, I do have specific titles in mind because I want to give as specific of an idea as possible. But listing authors can work if you are going for, something about that author's brand or vibe. Like if you want to say for fans of Adam Silvera, so you can kind of extrapolate that, okay, it's probably going to be queer and it's probably going to break your heart and it's probably going to be a standalone contemporary, maybe with a little bit of speculative elements.
But then that's going to go out the window when he publishes
his
YA
fantasy. True. So yeah, naming specific titles is probably a better bet as a general rule, but you definitely can name authors.
And also, just generally, I realize this is the first time we've talked about comp titles on the podcast. Just to briefly define it, this is when in your query, comp title stands for comparative titles. So you're giving the agent a sense of where your book would sit on the shelf, which is another reason to be as specific as possible. And also to ensure that you're using recent titles. Anything older than, say, 3 years, maybe 4, you're really pushing it. This fits into the market conversation because of how quickly the market can turn, is why you want to use relatively recently published books and nothing too famous, none of those outliers.
Don't say your book is like Twilight and Harry Potter, because that tells the agent immediately that you're not very familiar with the market.
Yeah, what is that book? A School for Vampires. Vampire Academy.
There it is, yeah.
All right, that is our episode. Again, thank you to all of our patrons for your support. You can check out our page at patreon.com/noveltyshow, where our patrons can suggest topics, ask questions, vote in polls, and participate in our exclusive Discord channel.
We also broadcast live shows on YouTube. You can subscribe to our channel, Novelty Show. Follow us on Twitter at Novelty Show for updates and announcements.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice, and we'd really appreciate it if you can rate and review us on iTunes and Google Play. Doing so helps bump us up in the ratings and helps other listeners find us. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, happy writing.